other topics, it condemned the kidnapping, torture and killing of an Italian researcher, Giulio Regini, in Cairo in 2016. Live now to Brussels. And my colleague Niamh Barker. Niamh, why did the decision go in this way?
Well, firstly, quite a resounding defeat for this resolution, 608 to 61 at the European Parliament. The resolution was brought by two Italian MEPs on behalf of the Socialist and Democratic Alliance, which, just to explain, is a left-leaning bloc of MEPs across the European Union within the European Parliament. It's difficult to say exactly what the reasoning was for it to go so drastically in the other direction for those who brought this resolution, but the feeling is that the arguments were perhaps not strong enough in piling extra pressure on the Egyptian authorities when it comes to holding the government there to account for alleged human rights violations. But the Italian government has been very, very vocal in recent days, accusing the Egyptian authorities of deliberately interfering in the case of Giulio Regini, who was murdered in 2016. He was a Cambridge University PhD researcher. He disappeared in January of 2016. His body was found several weeks later with signs that he had been repeatedly tortured. The Italian investigators concluded that this was a state-sponsored killing. That's been denied by the Egyptians. But last week, we saw 4 high-level Egyptian officials accused of being involved in the kidnapping and murder. We believe now that a trial will be on the way with these accused being dealt with in absentia. When it comes to this resolution, though, it comes very much as a blow to human rights groups who believe that more should be done by members of the European Union when it comes to piling on the pressure on Egypt regarding its human rights records. The finger has also been pointed at Germany, at France, and also at the United Kingdom for continued arms trails to sales to Egypt while all of this background business happens, all of these accusations of violations.
Niamh, thank you very much. Niamh Barker there for us in Brussels. Sudan's military has accused Ethiopian forces and militias of ambushing its officers during a security patrol close to the border on Tuesday. It says a number of soldiers were killed in an area bordering Ethiopia's Tigray region, where the Ethiopian government has been carrying out an armed campaign against local forces. Sudan's Prime Minister went to Ethiopia on Sunday and expressed concerns about threats to Sudan's security along its border with Tigray. Rescue teams have recovered bodies of 4 children after a boat carrying migrants sank off the coast of Libya. The Libyan Red Crescent got reports of a sinking boat carrying 30 people near the coast of Zawiya, west of the capital Tripoli. The search for other bodies continues and no survivors have been found. Libya is a major transit hub for migrants, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, trying to cross over to Europe. The EU's top court has ruled Hungary is guilty of breaking asylum law. The European Court of Justice found migrants and refugees were denied a right to apply for asylum and forcibly deported to the Serbian border. It also found that no special protection was offered to children or the vulnerable. Hungary had implemented anti-immigration policies during the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015. The owners of the company blamed for fueling the deadly opioid crisis in the United States have been questioned by a congressional committee. The Sackler family owns Purdue Pharma, maker of the addictive prescription painkiller OxyContin. Last month, Purdue admitted its responsibility for the opioid epidemic raging across the United States. Heidi Jo Castro joins us now from Capitol Hill. So, Heidi, what kind of questions are they asking there?
Well, this was the first time that we saw members of the Sackler family themselves begrudgingly dragged out in public, in a sense, to take accountability for the 450,000 people who have died in the United States since the beginning of this opioid crisis. But if it was an apology that people and Congress people were trying to get, well, that's not what came out. We heard from 2 cousins who were members of the Purdue Pharma board, David and Kathy Sackler, their cousins, and given an opportunity, asked point blank to apologize to the American people today. They said they were sorry for all the pain and suffering for the deaths, but that if they were able to go back in time, they would not change their own actions.
Over the years, OxyContin has been on the market, Purdue worked to reduce the risks of addiction and abuse in a number of ways. In the past 20 years, Purdue spent more than $1 billion on anti-abuse and diversion initiatives. Purdue instituted what I understand was the first voluntary abuse and diversion detection program in 2002. This program was expanded and endorsed by various state governments, who later required Purdue to keep the program in place, and I understand it was used as a model for at least one other pharmaceutical company to follow.
And while there has been much talk by these witnesses about the efforts that Purdue Pharma is taking to try to address this crisis, Peter, of course, it's still ongoing. We're always talking about the COVID pandemic, but before that and after, there will still continue to be this other crisis happening in the United States, and namely OxyContin will continue to be prescribed.
Heidi, if and when this comes to the concept of financial money being given, compensation being given to the families of people who've died here, we could be talking about millions or billions of dollars, yeah?
Yeah, potentially. And that is also one pressing issue why members of the House Oversight Committee insisted on bringing in these board members today, because prior to a legal settlement that was just in court a month ago, there are records showing that the Sackler family withdrew up to $10 billion out of their the pharmacological company to enrich themselves. And the question that the committee has been giving to these board members is whether or not they did that, namely to enrich themselves, knowing that a bad judgment was coming their way and that there would be less money now for the victims to have in way of a settlement.
Okay, Heidi, thank you very much. Heidi Jo Castro there for us in Washington. Well, the US government has declared the opioid crisis as a public health emergency. It started in the late 1990s when doctors began to prescribe opioid painkillers at greater rates in the mistaken belief that they were not addictive. By 2018, according to the most recent figures available, around 10 million Americans were misusing the medication, and more than 800,000 were using heroin, many of them addicts who turned to illicit drugs when they could no longer get prescriptions refilled. The US Department of Health says more than 130 Americans die every day from opioid-related overdoses. That's 48,000 people per year. Let's talk now to Marcus Plecia. He's Chief Medical Officer at the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. He joins us on Skype from Charlotte, North Carolina. Marcus Plecia, welcome to the NewsHour. Is the central allegation here, or the central suspicion, because I don't want to push you into saying anything that's strictly speaking illegal, is the central suspicion here that the company knew it was addictive as soon as it started the process whereby the drug was prescribed to people?
Yes, I think that's the basic premise of the legal actions we've taken. And that has been a concern, that the information that was provided about this medication really was not accurate. And, many providers, healthcare providers, physicians, other clinicians acted based on, misunderstanding or misinformation about the medications, and particularly this issue of whether it's addictive or not. I mean, these medications are clearly very addictive, but there was early communication that they were not, particularly for people who were suffering from pain.
At point of delivery or point of contact, why did the medical world, or why did state government or a federal government not get involved in this? I mean, clearly if somebody goes back to their, I would say GP, but goes back to their pharmacologist or their doctor and says, I really need this drug, at some point surely there must have been a doctor-patient conversation where the doctor might have thought, this person is addicted, and that's clear to me as that person's doctor. Why did nobody raise the alarm bells sooner than the alarm bells were raised?
Well, actually, the medical profession and state governments, and to some extent the federal government, have been reacting to this problem for quite some time, for probably a decade or more. One of the early things we did was put in to place monitoring systems so that you could go online. If you're a clinician, you could go online, and when somebody is requesting pain medication, you could check to see when they last got pain medication. So this practice of shopping around and going one place and another to get the medications could be stopped. Many of those systems were built, a decade or more ago. So we've known about the problem. I think we've also done a lot to educate physicians over the last decade. So there have been actions, but there's not been anything as significant as these legal actions and these liability suits. And hopefully these are the kinds of things that clearly puts this particular practice to an end, but also hopefully discourages it in the future.
What does this tell us about this specific drugs company and about the drugs company business in general in the United States?
I think it's part of a pattern that we've seen for decades now of, how pharmaceutical companies market and advertise their products. And I think what it tells us is we really have to be attentive to that, and we have to set some limits on how they advertise, what kind of access they have to the medical community, and what kind of information they're putting forward. And we have seen that improve. I mean, the access that the pharmaceutical industry has to medical care provisions has changed dramatically since I started my career as a young physician. I mean, and that's been a very, very good change. And some of that comes from society. Some of that comes, I think, from the medical profession stepping up and realizing this is not the way that professionals can behave. Some of the sort of gift-giving and really kind of lavish encounters between clinicians and pharmaceutical representatives, that's been put an end to. But I think we need to continue to be really cognizant of that and take steps to continue to have a bit of a barrier between the folks who are marketing these drugs and the professional people whose job it is to prescribe and monitor them.
As you're talking to us, Marcus, we're looking at pictures of people protesting, I suspect, either outside Congress and or outside the this particular company's head offices, perhaps, trying to raise awareness of what they've experienced, what they've witnessed when it comes to family and friends. So we're seeing questions in Congress today in real time. This may yet go to a legal case. It may go to a class action. We've been hearing that as well today. In a perfect world, what will be the outcome of this when people have got compensation, when they remember the people who've died? What will be after that?
Well, I think potentially the greatest benefit of a significant civil action, and particularly if the judgment on that were severe, it raises the liability. It makes it very clear to pharmaceutical companies that there could be significant liability if they're not careful with how they market and communicate about their drugs. So although I think it could be beneficial to people to have some kind of compensation for the suffering they've had, I suspect most of these folks are motivated by the idea that they want to have a significant judgment that would discourage this kind of behavior from corporate entities in the future.
An important story that needs to be told. Marcus Plecia, thank you so much for joining us here on the News Hour on Al Jazeera. Well, as you were hearing there, the opioid crisis has devastated the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. John Hendren has been meeting some of the victims in Chicago.
Tim Ryan was the recruiting director for a Chicago consulting company, and he founded a multi-million-dollar executive search firm. He was also a drug addict.
People have this misconception that an opiate addict is the homeless person on the corner with the brown paper bag. That's 5%. The average opiate addict is a 22-year-old white middle-class male and a 23-year-old white middle-class female. The disease of addiction does not discriminate.
After using for years, he caught his son using heroin and opiates and joined him.
My son and I, that's how we bonded. Nick and I bonded by doing drugs every day.
Then for Tim came addiction, prison, and sobriety. For his son Nick, a cycle of addiction, jail, rehab, and relapse. On the day Tim recorded his 21st month of sobriety, Nick suffered a fatal overdose.
The doctor took me to the room right next to where we were, and I walked in there, And to see my 20-year-old son's cold, blue, lifeless body just laying there with a sheet up to his chest, and he still had the device in his mouth where they were trying to aspirate him. I mean, tears just started flowing down.
Now, with his wife, former supermodel Jennifer Jimenez, he helps former addicts through their substance abuse program, Dope to Hope. Often, users begin with legally prescribed painkillers after an injury. Then when those run out, they move on to heroin or fentanyl, a powerful and dangerous synthetic opioid bought from street corner drug dealers. For too many opioid users, the journey through addiction ends like this.
John, can you hear me?
An overdose on a street corner. The lucky ones survive to end up here in the emergency room, now seeing more opioid overdoses than ever. Overdoses are up 55% in 2020 compared to 2019.
Black people and inner city people have a more challenging time recovering because the drug is so available in their communities.
One opioid manufacturer, OxyContin maker Purdue Pharma, has acknowledged its role in the opioid epidemic. The company has paid $634 million in fines and pleaded guilty to contributing to thousands of opioid deaths, now surging as the pandemic drives many back to drugs.
They need purpose and connection. They need that human interaction. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going back to abusing and using opiates. And when you're messing with opiates, you're going to die.
It is an epidemic growing within a pandemic as the number of fatal opioid overdoses continues to rise. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Chicago.
Still to come on this program for you. A decade after the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, we look at what has and has not changed. And Adelaide is the stage as one of the year's most highly anticipated cricket matches gets underway. Details coming up with Andy in sport in about 15 minutes.
Hello once again. The weather remains largely dry across a good part of the Middle East. We have got some showers still leaking their way out of Turkey, just pushing over towards the Caspian Sea. Northern parts of Iran could see some showery rain from time to time, maybe one or two showers into the west as well. But south of that, it is generally dry. National Day here in Qatar on Friday. Temperatures at around 24 Celsius, a light wind. Perhaps a little bit of early morning mist and fog to watch out for. That'll shift by Saturday as the winds pick up. Maybe a line of wetter weather just sliding out of northern parts of Saudi Arabia for a time. Not too much on this, but some rain there, a possibility nevertheless. Chance of some rain too, just around the Gulf of Aden. Some wetter weather in play here. We'll see that wetter weather just affecting the north of Somalia as we go through the next day or so. One or two showers just sliding towards the Horn of Africa. Elsewhere across Central Africa, plenty of showers around the Rift Valley, sliding down across Zambia towards Botswana. We'll see some heavy showers for a time too into Zimbabwe. Southern parts of Zimbabwe seeing some heavy rain. Central and southern parts, Mozambique also looking pretty disturbed over the next couple of days. And that rain in southern Mozambique pepping up for Saturday with the possibility of flooding.
The virus is indiscriminate, yet those living in poverty are far more vulnerable to the dangers of COVID-19. Ali Ray examines the reasons for this disparity.
The social and economic inequalities that surround us are much deeper and much more problematic than we thought.
And asks whether lessons learned from the global pandemic could lead to positive change.
The health of the poor affects the health of the rich.
All hail the lockdown. Expose it. Privilege and poverty during a crisis. On Al Jazeera.
Following two fatal crashes in the past year, Boeing decided to ground the brand new 737 MAX. But this wasn't the first time they'd grounded a new aircraft. Back in 2013, the 787 Dreamliner ran into trouble when a battery caught fire. But as Al Jazeera's investigative unit discovered, there was more to the problem than just smoking batteries. Rewind Broken Dreams, the Boeing 787 on Al Jazeera.
Welcome back. Let's just recap all your top stories for you here on Aljaeera. A Nigerian schoolboy who managed to escape capture from a faction of Boko Haram says he and others were abducted by people wearing military uniforms. Hundreds of students were kidnapped from a school in northern Katsina state last week. At least 17 have been rescued. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, has tested positive for COVID-19. He'll self-isolate and continue to work remotely. The French Prime Minister will also self-isolate after coming into contact with Monsieur Macron. The US has registered 2 coronavirus records in one day for the number of new deaths and cases. Nearly 3,500 people died and close to 250,000 have been infected. US government agencies are rushing to tighten their computer security systems after confirming they've been hit in a long-running and a sophisticated hacking operation. The attackers are suspected to be Russian. They pierced cyber defenses and accessed email and internal files at the Treasury and Commerce departments and possibly elsewhere. An FBI investigation is ongoing in order to find out who was responsible. The Treasury and Commerce departments were among dozens infiltrated. Joanna Bryson is a professor of ethics and technology at the Hertie School of Governance. She says pulling off a hack on this scale would require significant expertise and resources.
It is sophisticated. I've been reading what the Microsoft has blogged about this, and they do a lot on transnational cybersecurity, of course. And they claim that it's not only that somebody did a reasonably sophisticated job of getting into the software itself, but also that somebody had to have been physically on site to get access to the tokens. That's like the security bits that made it look like people were authorized to have made those changes to the code. So it is reasonably sophisticated. I mean, it's kind of like September 11th. You know, you think, how hard is it to fly in a plane? Is this really a nation state? Of course it was. The amount of organization that it took, I guess, is at a nation state level. And the fact that it includes physical intrusion as well as the fact that they put the software together in a way that wasn't immediately noticed. Well, immediately for months.
The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, hasn't spoken specifically about this particular hacking incident during his annual media conference, but he has denied that Russian hackers ever meddled in the 2016 US elections. Mr. Putin has been fielding questions at his annual media conference from his private residence outside Moscow, addressing a wide range of issues. When asked about his future plans, Mr. Putin said he's not yet taken a decision on whether he'll run for the presidency again in 2024. In July, Mr. Putin changed the constitution to allow him to rule until 2036. The US is expected to unseal charges against another suspect in the 1988 Lockerbie bombing that killed 270 people. A Libyan intelligence officer identified as Abu Aguila Mohammed Massoud is accused of making the bomb that blew up the US aircraft over the Scottish town of Lockerbie. Most of the victims on the London to New York Pan Am Flight 103 were Americans. Massoud is reportedly in custody in Libya and is expected to be extradited to the US to stand trial there. Now, as global attention remains focused on managing the COVID-19 pandemic, the United Nations and several charities are warning of an unprecedented starvation crisis. The World Food Programme says 690 million people do not have enough to eat, and 130 million more are at risk of being pushed to starvation by the end of the year. The group identified 10 countries facing the worst food crises in 2019, with Yemen, South Sudan, and Afghanistan among the most severe. It's now feared the impact of COVID-19 could trigger multiple famines. In Zimbabwe, drought, the pandemic, and an economic recession have left 4 million people facing acute food shortages. It's not just developing nations facing shortages either. Now, UNICEF is helping to feed hungry children in the UK for the first time, with 2.4 million living in food insecure households. And in the US, more than 27 million Americans say they do not have enough to eat as food bank demand continues to surge.
The line today for the cars was over 2 miles, and there's been people that have been waiting here since 5:30 this morning. So people are driving upwards of an hour to 2 hours to get here, and then sitting in a line for 3 to 4 hours before they're able to get their box of food. So that says a lot of what's really going on in society, that people are that desperate.
I'm a pharmacist. I lost my job this year just due to layoffs and cutbacks. And, you know, my husband is working full time, but this has really helped just with staples.
I go from a double income household to a single income. My mom isn't working. I'm the only one working because my mom have to stay home with my daughter for online schooling. So it helps a lot because this is like 4 or 5 meals I don't have to worry about.
Okay, joining us here on the News Hour, Nate Mook. He's the CEO of World Central Kitchen. That's a non-profit organisation which uses food to heal communities and to strengthen economies in times of crisis. He joins us on Skype from Washington, D.C. Nate, welcome back to the News Hour. It's wrong to say this, but it's true. We are used to hearing about food insecurity tipping into famine in countries like Yemen, in countries like Afghanistan. But why in the first world are so many people going hungry?
Yeah, it is something that is really hard to grasp. And it's something that I think our leadership in the U.S. government is also struggling to comprehend and hence act upon, unfortunately. But it is something that we've been facing in the United States since the beginning of the pandemic. We started to see this unfold as millions of Americans lost their jobs. You know, there is not this social fabric and social structure in the United States to support families when they're out of work and unable to buy food. And all of that pressure then goes upon food banks, nonprofits that have to fill that gap. And unfortunately, as we're entering into now the most critical time with the number of cases rising to record levels, the number of jobs continue to be lost, nonprofits really have hit their limits of what they can do. We've been doing this for 9 months now. And unfortunately, you know, donations have dried up. And the lack of support from our federal government is really compounding the problem. And families, as you just heard, are incredibly desperate.
Is it almost, Nate, as if there are two Americas? Okay, the Trump administration is about to be a thing of the past, but we've got Ivanka Trump saying we're creating jobs, we're creating prosperity. We've got Donald Trump, although he hasn't done it recently, saying we're looking after all Americans. And then there's the real America, where people are just a couple of months away from real serious problem areas because they can't get enough money because they haven't got a job, and they're 2 or 3 paychecks away from slipping through the cracks.
You know, we've been seeing growing inequality in the United States for years, if not decades now. And I think what COVID has done is really accelerated that. You know, it's the folks working hourly jobs, folks in the service industry, including the restaurant and food and beverage sector, that have lost their job, you know, by the tens of millions. And so what's ended up happening is, you know, folks that have maybe perhaps a more stable and secure job, folks whose money is in the stock market, you know, the stock market is going up. And so, you know, certain folks can say, well, our economy is doing really well. But then you go to a city. Yesterday, we were in Miami, Florida, which is a fairly wealthy city, as you probably know. And there was a distribution of gift cards to go to the grocery store. You know, thousands of people lined up to get a gift card to buy food at a grocery store. They actually came the night before and slept in their cars because they didn't want to miss this opportunity. So absolutely, we're really seeing this divergence where you have growing desperation amongst hardworking Americans just trying to get through, and sort of a bit of an apathy from those that really are doing much better, that don't have to worry about all of the impacts of COVID on their lives, and in fact can benefit from some of the things like the increase in the stock market.
Who's failing whom here, Nate? I mean, at some level, maybe 2 months ago or 3 months ago, perhaps even back right at the beginning of the pandemic, surely local politicians were telling congressmen, they were telling senators, maybe you've done this, I don't know, tell us if you have, please. People like you must have been having conversations with local politicians who were reporting it up the food chain, saying, look, we have got a big problem coming here because we've done the interviews on this program. You know, we've had people on this show saying the American economy is constantly broken anyway, because to go back to what I said earlier, you know, it's people are 2 or 3 months away from not being able to live hand to mouth.
Absolutely. I think there's been failures on multiple levels. You're seeing failures at the local and state levels from officials who initially did not take the crisis very seriously. And that compounded the problems because it led to additional shutdowns and lockdowns that are needed. But ultimately, the way that the system should work is that when the states can't handle a crisis or a disaster like this, that's when the federal government has to step in and support. And this is what happens after hurricanes, after wildfires. This is a very normal course of action in the United States. Unfortunately, with COVID, this has not happened. Our Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has been missing in action despite this being a national disaster declaration in the United States. We have not had additional funding or support to states since the springtime when the last stimulus bill act passed. And now we're, really it's just been a long sort of depletion of that support at the local and state level. And, we have been absolutely pushing all the way up the chain. And, the disagreements at the federal government level have created this paralysis about how best to support. And in the process, the folks that are really feeling the impact of that are the families, are the hardworking Americans that are just trying to get through the day. And, there's not really any clarity that there is any hope or any support coming from up above. Now, certainly that could change with a new administration. Incoming President-elect Joe Biden has said there is going to be a big effort to get the American economy going again, to support Americans and just getting through the day, getting through the months. So, perhaps there's some light at the end of the tunnel coming, especially with vaccines on the way. But we still have a number of hard months ahead of us. This is not going to suddenly correct itself immediately. In fact, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So, it's unfortunate. We've been pushing at World Central Kitchen for the federal government to unlock existing disaster funds that have literally just been sitting in a bank account, not being spent to support those hungry families. And we've been hitting a wall. And so, it really is a challenging time to get anything done politically in this country. And the fact that it's in the middle of COVID that's happening is simply an American tragedy.
Okay, Nate, good to talk to you at this difficult time. Thank you very much. Nate Moot there in Washington.
Thank you so much.
10 years ago, a fruit seller in Tunisia set himself on fire in a desperate and a fatal act of protest. Mohamed Bouazizi's actions tapped into frustration and fury at home and across the region, leading to what became known as the Arab Spring. Tunisia is an Arab country that transitioned into democracy, but many say things have only got worse. And there were muted commemorations in Sidi Bouzid, where Tunisia's revolution began. Al Jazeera's Bernard Smith is there.
They're looking for a way out of Sidi Bouzid. This specially choreographed dance is being staged to mark the 10th anniversary of the start of the Tunisian revolution. Its performers hope that their skills will get them work outside Tunisia. The revolution has failed them. The eldest here is 24. That's young to be disillusioned.
The country is going to the wall, really, going to the wall. Nothing changed. It's like there was no revolution. We only changed the president. That's it.
There is too much freedom now. With it, you insult others. There is no security like there was before. You can be killed going to the stadium to watch a football match. These kind of things never happened before.
Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest against police in Sidi Bouzid, who often demanded bribes so he could sell from his streetcar. It was the spark for unprecedented protests that forced an autocratic president to flee and led to the Arab Spring that toppled regimes across the Middle East. Tunisia is one of the only Arab countries where democracy survived, but incomes have fallen by a fifth over the past decade.
Can't live on what the jobs pay in Sidi Bouzid. Life is more expensive. $100 per month job is only enough money for yourself. If you have a family, it's very difficult.
This is the memorial to Mohamed Bouazizi. Tunisia's unemployment rate was 11% when he died. Today, it's more than 15%. And there's been a fourfold increase in the amount of illegal migration to Europe just in the last 12 months. This generation protested against the authoritarian rule of Zine Abidine Ben Ali. Their anger and frustration at how things have turned out is clear.
Life was really very beautiful under Ben Ali. We used to have a very beautiful life. We lived happily together. We loved each other. We used to have everything. Now we don't have anything, only crime and other bad things.
The economy here is expected to contract by 6.5% this year. That's a significant challenge for any country. But there's arguably more pressure to get through the downturn in Tunisia, where its Jasmine Revolution is often held up as an example of how popular uprisings can succeed in the Middle East. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Sidi Bouzid.
Still to come here on the News Hour for you, the sports news with Andy. The verdict is in as Russia appeals against its 4-year ban from all major sporting events. Andy will have that story. He's waiting in the wings in about 90 seconds. Make way for Andy with the sports news.
Thank you so much, Peter. Well, Russia